at how they are equipped, and we compare that with the big sample of ports, which in the end will be several hundred ports within Europe, wherever possible. So, for example, we could come up with the idea that RoRo terminals, all RoRo terminals, at least more RoRo terminals, should be directly connected to the rail network. And there have been projects in the past. We've seen it. So every year there's new terminals, but still there are many terminals. I think more than half of the terminals we have in our sample that do not yet have a direct rail connection, even though it may be in the port, but not on the terminal. Another benchmark would be at least 14.5 meters maximum. Maybe this would be even more, ship chord for deep sea container ports. And in order to identify these benchmarks that are for ship sizes, we're not looking just at the best ports, because you may have 25 meters, but again, that's not necessary for ports. But we look at the current regular services, RoRo services and container services, deep sea, short sea apart. And then we can just see the major ships. So, for example, with a draught of 14.5 meters, you can handle, for example, 80% of the deep sea deep sea services currently fully loaded, things like that. So that's of course a very detailed work. We're not finishing it until the detailed implementation plan. That work will go on in the future. And the fourth step then is, of course, to compare the performance with the benchmark or aim for all ports. When we see that the big sample or all the ports analyzed are already complying with a certain standard, then of course this is no longer a priority for the detailed implementation plan, even though there may be single projects in ports that maybe, depends on the formulation, can still be integrated, but at least it won't be the focus of the plan. Whereas when there's still a big gap between the aim and the status quo, then of course this hints to a development need. At least we cannot exclude it. Then of course it's also a matter of weighing, which we cannot do based on data, but also on priorities that will be set by political objectives. And then we have, as I said, a big diversity in Europe that we have to take into account when doing this analysis. And I think I step up. It's easy to see. So as you can see here, it's about we have several hundred maritime ports in Europe, which are in principle all connected through the sea, because you can once you're in the maritime part, you can go to every other port. So the number of combinations is almost infinite. These ports handled about 3.6 billion tons of cargo in 2014. 2.2 million of that, so a little more than half of that, was traffic between European ports. Can you all hear me by the way? So more than half of this traffic is between European ports, which does not necessarily mean it's intra-European trade, because you have a lot of feeder traffic, especially between the North Range and the Baltic Sea and also in the Black Sea. But in general, it's intra-European traffic between European ports is very important in this context. Then we have connections with the Atlantic, through the Atlantic towards the Americas, but also to the western part of Africa. And we have connections basically through the Suez Canal towards Asia and Eastern Africa. And we have heard about it, the Northern Sea route, of course, in future may become more and more important for the Asian trade also. So here you can see everybody knows this map by far. We have to redraw it in our geographic information system, the major corridors. And you can see the different, it's about 80 ports that are at the start and end points of these corridors. A lot of traffic, the powerhouse of the European traffic is there in the, say, Hamburg-Le Havre range, But you can see that big ports are situated everywhere on the map. And as we always say, the corridors, of course, of the cargo doesn't stop here. It uses then the maritime way to go further. These 80 ports already account for 2.5 billion tons, so a large part of the total. 79% of the deep sea traffic, but only 63% of the short sea traffic. You will see that, especially for the short sea traffic, the comprehensive ports and other ports also have a very important role. Here, what has changed here on the map now is the share of deep sea and short sea traffic. Deep sea traffic in red and the short sea traffic in green. You can see that the North Range, the Mediterranean, there you can see very high shares of deep sea traffic, whereas the Baltic Sea is in a large part also served indirectly via the North Range ports, and also Constanta has deep sea traffic and also established itself as a hub. But in general, the short sea shares are also higher in the Black Sea. Zooming in the different regions, you see this is the map that some here don't like at all. You have all the Botany Gulf empty. You have several corridors arriving here. Only, if you look at this map, you only have two maritime links, which is Mentali and the tunnel. But if you look at the actual connections, that's the regular shipping services that are currently in place, you see that there's much more than this. And you can, for example, see the Kraken link that we have heard about. You have the Frederikshavn Göteborg. You have, of course, a lot of island traffic. Bornholm is down here. Many other links that are connecting Scandinavia with the continent. So the vast majority of trade between the north and the south, it's not going through the tunnel or over the bridges, but it's really going on ferries, on ships, on, of course, also bulkers and tankers. And reducing the complexity a little, we just showed here the services with more than 5,000 trucks per year, according to statistics we had in 2014, which, if you want to think about it, it's about 1,000 trains for each of these connections minimum. And then you can see that the big connections concentrate here in the southern part. They're basically connecting the continent with Scandinavia, especially Sweden. And then, of course, also the two which are already part of the corridor, the Tallinn link and the Stockholm-Naanta link. What you cannot see here, but actually the two links with the largest traffic volume are here, Stuttgart and Rötli, where the tunnel will be in future, but it's still a maritime link so far. And there's Helsingborg, Helsingør link, which also is a very short distance, but a lot of traffic. So we were talking about congestion in the Copenhagen-Malmö area. A lot of traffic, invisible on the corridor maps, is also going through this link. In the North Sea, we see a similar picture. We're just using the motorways of the sea to go across to Great Britain, and then from Great Britain to Ireland. And again, there's the Dover-Calais link, but there's also the Liverpool-Dublin link, but many other alternative routes going in and out, even though, of course, the Calais-Dover route in terms of volume stands out as the single most important link between Great Britain and the continent. In the Mediterranean, we have quite a different picture. Of course, here, if you show all services, there's a lot of services, especially serving the islands. But if you go to the ones with the largest cargo volumes, it's rather multi-stop, long-distance roads. So the say, sometimes parallel to the coastal line, which is not as in the North Sea, for example, to cross the ocean, cross the channel, but in this case, basically to move cargo from land, from road to sea, or from the coastlines to the maritime. Similar picture in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where again you can see the Adriatic link, which is more or less going in parallel. Maybe in futures, some of these links across the Adriatic will also pass the threshold of these 50,000 traders. But here again, we see that the large part of volumes is on this MoS projects, on the long distance multi-stop projects. So as I said, we have this port diversity, but the horizontal priorities need to be defined in general terms. The actual project proposals then must come from the port, from the line operators, and all other stakeholders involved, and then on the evaluated port offer the line of the budget. To sum up, as long as motorways of the sea are mostly used because there's no road or rail, then there's still considerable room for improvement. They're not yet seen as the fourth mode, as an option, an alternative to road and rail, but basically just when there's no other option. So I think there's still large potential for motorways of the sea in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Well, we've come to the end of the forum, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming and sticking with us till the end. And now I invite you all for a cocktail for half an hour or so. And as I said, thank you for coming. We'll correlate the information and what you say over drinks and so forth, so that we have a good idea of what we're putting in the detail in the presentation. Okay, thanks a lot.